I'm going to bring in the more political perspective and the policymakers' perspective. But before being elected, I was actually an academic, so I'm going to start with 3 questions because that's the way I always think. The first important question is, if we are genuinely making the progress that Roger hopes we're making on sustainable finance, then it would mean that we were sending clear signals to business about the fact that a lot of the assets they're currently holding will no longer have value as we make the sustainability transition. So if we're sending that signal clearly and they're receiving it clearly, why is it that fossil fuel stock values are not falling more rapidly? That's my first question. And you can think about that question yourself, but my answer to that question is they don't really believe I'm serious. They're wrong about that. But the point is, we as policymakers are deciding that these assets don't have value, and we need to communicate that clearly because that's what the transition requires. Now, the second big question when you're working on sustainable finance is, are you mostly concerned with defining very tightly the bits of the economy that are green, or are you concerned with ensuring that more of the economy and ultimately all of the economy becomes green? And that's the sort of distinction between the niche or the mainstream. When you're designing a policy, is it about that niche, for example, defining tightly what a green bond is so you don't have greenwashing, or is it about saying that all pension funds now have to report the sustainability impact of the assets they're holding? In fact, it's both of those things, but we have to sort of keep the balance between those two when we're making policy. And the third important question is, how much of the money we need to spend to ensure we move through the sustainability transition is going to be private money and how much is going to be public money, and what is the impact on the future society we're building of the decision we make about that? So, for example, there are plenty of things we need to invest in to make the sustainability transition which will not be profitable. And yet, we know we need to have those things. I would give as an example insulation of the homes of poor people. It's one of the fastest ways of reducing energy demand and carbon emissions, but they can't afford to pay for it. That requires public investment. You won't be able to create that in a way that somebody can profit from it. But also, if we fund the whole of the transition through private finance, whether that's borrowing, whether that's through a bond, then other people will be profiting from the transition, and that will build in inequality. And one of the things I would like to see as we move through this transition is that we also move to be a more equal society, and that's what we call the just transition. So, as Roger said, and I agree with him about this, the finance community has woken up to this agenda, and I do believe in the power of private finance in spite of what I've just said, and so that's actually very exciting. So I would say, when was the best time to do this? The answer is about 30 years ago. But the second best time to do this is right now. So it's good that the finance community has woken up. And I think one of the things that's changed the perception of what's going on, probably amongst financiers, certainly amongst the public, is the absolutely crazy weather we're all living through. I mean, when I said 30 years ago the climate's going to change, people were like, yada, yada, right? But last summer, having lived through that, everywhere in the world there was an extraordinary heat wave. Nobody is now saying that climate change isn't happening. And as a consequence of that, we've got Extinction Rebellion blocking the streets of London, we've got the school strikers in most of our cities, we've got Greta Thunberg turning up at Davos and at the UN, and the young people are essentially saying, we want a future, you have to act now. And that has hugely shifted the kinds of things we can talk about in terms of sustainability transition. For example, I pledged to fly only once during my last mandate, and I'm making the same pledge for this mandate. When I did that 5 years ago, everybody was just sort of completely dismissive. But now people are thinking that's an important thing to do, and I'm going to think about whether I can do that, or I can just fly once every 2 years or whatever. So what we call the Overton window, the space in which we think that's a reasonable policy commitment, has shifted radically as a result of this street action that we've been seeing. And I think from the point of view of financial players, what they need most of all is certainty around which of their assets will continue to have value in the future. And that's why the leaders on this agenda have been the pension funds and the insurance companies, because they're holding money for the long term. And if you're under the age of 40 in this room and your pension contains any fossil fuel assets, then that's been missold, because we know those assets will not be delivering any value after 2050. We've made that commitment. And that's why long-term finance is most keen on this agenda. But industry and finance companies alike need certainty around what the price of carbon is going to be. And that's why my kind of key policy ask during this 5 years of the European Parliament is that we introduce a carbon tax. And I've been really surprised about the number of businesses and finance companies who agree about that. But that's because they need that certainty. I spend a lot of my life at the moment being a human graph that does this. This graph just says, here's the price of carbon, there's the price of carbon at 2050 when we no longer have any fossil fuels in our economy. I'd like to see this point at 2030, but the European Union's about to agree it's 2050. This trajectory is very important for all businesses. They need to know how an investment to reduce carbon emissions is going to pay back. And it's our job as politicians to be clear about what that trajectory looks like. A carbon tax is the fastest and easiest way of producing that clear trajectory. So, I think I have been impressed by the amount of cooperation, even enthusiasm on the part of various finance players as we've been moving through this sustainable finance agenda. But I think sustainable finance does represent an opportunity for the finance sector to rebuild trust. When I joined the European Parliament in 2014, it was just at the tail end of putting in place all the legislation that was necessary to repair the financial sector after the 2008 crisis, when trust in financiers couldn't have been lower. And a lot of the people that work on the sustainable finance agenda say, well, this is payback time now. The European public, and in fact citizens across the world, put a huge amount of money into bailing out the finance sector. Now we need that to be repaid in terms of financing a rapid sustainability transition to tackle climate change. So let me just talk through quickly some of the key policy developments that are happening in the European Parliament. I've worked on a couple of these bits of legislation myself, and the first one is the mandatory disclosure regime. So we've already heard about people making decisions about how to invest their money and which pensions to buy on the basis of information about the sustainability impacts. But actually 40% of people know little or nothing about what their pension investments are actually doing. And half say that if they did have that information, they would make their investments in a way that reflected their own values. So we need to have that information. As an economist, one of the basic rules of a capitalist economy is total information, right? Perfect information we're supposed to have as consumers. But actually, when we started working on this agenda, we had to kind of have a little battle with right-wing people in the Parliament and some of the finance companies who said, no, it's absolutely fine. People don't need to know what their money's doing. Anyway, the mandatory disclosure regime that we passed back in April and that's going to come into force in mid-2021 is the end of that. Because we were negotiating with some Eastern Europeans, unfortunately we did have to have a comply and explain clause which says that you can say, well, we're just not going to tell you. But to be honest with you, if your pension company says we're not going to tell you, probably a good idea to switch your pension to somewhere else. So otherwise we will now, as people who buy financial products across the European market, have a lot more information about what the sustainability impacts of those products will be. And one of the things that is limiting that, and is the reason that when we negotiated in the Council, they were quite conservative about the introduction of this regime, was that they told us that companies actually do not know what the sustainability impact of their activities are. And so one of the other bits of law that we've got to tighten up is the Nonfinancial Reporting Directive. We need to have a clear way of measuring and then reporting what companies are actually doing and what the sustainability impacts are in terms of climate, in terms of supply chain, for example, conflict minerals, and just generally in terms of impact on the environment. So that's an agenda that's going to make a huge difference to the behaviour of finance companies, because rather than saying, oh, we're the green pension provider, so we'll tell you what's happening with your money, everybody's going to have to do that or have a good reason why not. Secondly, we introduced two new benchmarks. It's called benchmarks, but it's basically indexes. So Standard & Poor's, for example, will produce an index. It has a lot of companies in it. We have produced the regulation so we can say whether those indexes are climate friendly or not, effectively. If we can introduce credible standards for these indexes, then there's a lot of money on a global basis that will want to flow into them. Public pension funds, people who want to have sustainable investments. If we can have closely defined benchmarks, then they will move in that direction. We defined two different benchmarks, one of which was a Paris-aligned benchmark. So this is going back to my point about the niche or the mainstream. So this is a niche for companies that are already aligned with the Paris Agreement. So wind farm, for example. But we also defined another one which is called the climate transition benchmark. And that's about companies which will survive the transition. So let's say companies that build cement. They might be heavy users of energy at the moment, but we will still need them in the future economy. And it's giving them an incentive to make a rapid transition to reduce their carbon emissions by saying that if you make real and measurable improvements in your carbon performance, then you will be able to be a part of this particular index. And so one of the questions I asked Roger earlier, and I think this is probably the only time I'm going to mention Brexit, but the interesting question for me is, what will the role of the City of London be after Brexit? Will it be developing its own standards and benchmarks? Will it be using European standards? I think it's an important question for where a leading finance centre in London fits into this whole sustainable finance picture. And just briefly on the politics of sustainable finance in the European Union, in terms of the Parliament, you probably know that the big winners actually were the Greens. We increased our size more than any other group. But we also had an important change in terms of the Liberal group. And often in the last Parliament, they were the people that were blocking some of our sustainability-related work. And now they've changed their name to Renew. And obviously there was a big boost because we sent a lot of Liberal Democrats, but also the French Macronista party also contributed a lot, and they've shifted their position, so they're, I think, likely to become keen supporters of this agenda in the new Parliament. But on the other hand, we've got the Visegrad countries who are now, so that's the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, and they are actively organising to block this agenda. So the reason we don't have a zero carbon target by 2050 is that in the Council, these countries blocked that target. So that's some politics that needs to get sorted out, because we can't allow a small number of countries to block the urgent action we need to be taking. So I just wanted to quickly say something about the Green New Deal as well, because this is more coming back to my point about public finance. We had some negotiations in the Parliament about what our policy agenda would look like for these 5 years. And it was really encouraging to me. This was with the 4 pro-European groups, so the Greens, this Renew Liberal group, the Socialists, and the main right-wing group, the EPP. What was so encouraging was that we all agreed that we need to have a major public investment in this sustainability transition. And obviously in the European context, we have the European Investment Bank, which we say should be turned into a climate bank to facilitate the transition. Now, again, if Brexit happens, we're no longer part of the European Investment Bank, then we need to replace it, in my view, with a public bank in the UK dedicated to that function. Otherwise, it's going to run into the issue around equity and also the question of how we will fund the sustainability transition that cannot make a profit. So, to conclude, change is coming. Those who embrace the change will flourish in this new world. It's obvious that some people will try to hide their dirty activities and play some sort of chicken game with policymakers, and my job is to say there's nowhere to hide. We are determined that we will tackle climate change and beyond that the other environmental crises we face. Therefore, we're going to introduce firm regulation, and we're going to ensure that the sustainability transition happens as rapidly as possible. But there's still a profit to be made. We still need finance. In fact, finance has an enormously important role at the moment in funding this sustainability transition. So it's good to be here. It's good to be sharing these ideas with you. And it's really exciting, actually, to be part of an agenda that's spreading so rapidly, and that so many kind of clever minds are turned towards thinking about how we can make this succeed. So I'll hand over to you at 6 o'clock, because I have to go back to Brussels then, but hopefully by 8 o'clock you'll have resolved all those issues and you can send me an email. Thank you very much.